Welcome to the Pedestrian and Bicycle Count training session. I'm Bob Schneider of the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. I'm an assistant professor in urban planning, for those of you guys who may not know me. We have a videographer today from the Milwaukee County Parks. That's Ramsey Radokovich.
Hello.
What I'm going to be going over today for the first 5 or 10 minutes here before we actually go out to the intersection and do a practice count is the count forms themselves, so that we know what to do with those when we get them out in the field. As well as the instructions. Now, the instruction sheet is something that I've included in an email attachment to everybody who's doing the counting. It's your guideline for what you should be doing, and it includes a little bit of information about the background and then some information about counting pedestrians and counting bicyclists. The first thing that you're going to do when you go to your count site is, one, don't go there on a day when it's raining like today. You've got to have certain weather conditions. It's going to be a nice day. So it can be partly cloudy or even mostly cloudy, but it shouldn't be raining, or it shouldn't be forecast for rain, at least a pretty good chance of it. So you can make your own determination of that. We're trying to avoid the days when it rains just because the patterns of pedestrian and bicycle activity are different those days. So that's a key thing. The next thing is the most important thing to remember about our general counting process. We're going to be counting at intersections, and so when we count pedestrians, we're counting every time a pedestrian crosses each leg of the street. And we're going to be counting each time a bicyclist approaches the intersection from each leg of the street. So, for example, when a pedestrian crosses the east leg of the intersection, they're going to be counted. If that same person crosses the north leg of the intersection after crossing the east leg, they're counted again. So every single crossing is counted for the pedestrians. Every single bicyclist who comes and uses the intersection is counted. The bicyclists may be going straight, they may be turning left, or may be turning right. Welcome back. We just went over the general idea of counting pedestrians and counting bicyclists at the intersection. So when you arrive at the intersection, you'll have this count form with you. You'll actually have 8 of these sheets, because each one of these sheets is for a 15-minute period, and you're going to be counting for 2 hours total. So you'll also want to have a watch with you, or some way to keep track of the time, so you can go from one sheet to the next every 15 minutes. Something else to remember is, especially when the first time you're going out to an intersection for the first time, you want to get there a little bit early so you can stake out a good spot to see each approach to the intersection. That's really important because the bicyclists often approach at a relatively fast speed, and so if you can see them coming down the way, you'll have a better chance of actually catching them, seeing them, and recording them. It's really important that we get the total numbers of pedestrians and bicyclists correct, or at least as good a job as we can do on that. When we practice, we'll see that is sometimes easier said than done, and that's why we practice. So, arriving early is helpful for that. When you actually arrive early, you'll have a chance to fill in the background information at the top of each sheet. You put the time in if it's blank. The ones that are for the afternoon peak, there's a 4 o'clock to 4:15, 4:50 to 4:30, and so on. If you're doing your Saturday count, this will start at noon until you write from 12 to 12:15 and so on there. You'll also write the name of the intersection, so that's the name of both streets. In this case, it'll be Humboldt and Locust. The date of the count, today is June 11th. The weather, we would write that down. Here today, we'd be writing down both the temperature and the cloud cover. So it's important to write both those things. You wouldn't just put rainy, you'd put 67 degrees and rainy. The different weather conditions besides the temperature, you put cloudy, partly cloudy, mostly sunny, or sunny. Those are your options. That's all the degree of accuracy you need. Then you write your name. And so then we know who did the counts for the future and when these get entered into our database. The form itself has 2 different parts. There are 2 diagrams that show the intersection itself. Both these represent, you can show that there, these both represent the intersection. And you want to orient your form so that you're facing north with the north arrow pointed north.
And I use my smartphone to orient myself.
Yeah, you can do that.
And then if I get really distracted, I'll like write what's on the corner of each, just in
That's
case.
helpful. Yeah, so it's always helpful to get yourself oriented correctly so you know which intersection is which as you start counting, especially at the beginning. So the north here for pedestrian crossings represents the north leg of the intersection. That's where you're going to put the tallies for pedestrians crossing the street. Over here on the right side, you've got the bicycle side of the diagram. And on the north leg, people approaching from the north will be on the top. So it's not people traveling from the south to the north, but these are people approaching from the north leg are going to be recording there. When they turn right, they get put into the right box. Straight is the straight box, and when they turn left, they get put in the left box.
So this is the left, if they're coming from the north, this is the left
That's
box.
right. So if they're coming from the north and they're turning to the left, which means they're going to go to the east, they get recorded in that box that says left on the top part of the bicycle trip intersection diagram. So that's the basic idea of where you put your count tallies. The second thing about the count tallies is that you're going to note male and female within these tallies, which is different than the Bike Fed's standard methodology for doing this. It really, we're recording the same things, but we're recording it in a slightly different way. So anybody who's done Bike Fed counts before, this is a little bit different, and this is really the only major difference. So when you get somebody who is male, you mark an X in the appropriate box. So if a male is crossing the north crosswalk, you mark an X there. If a female crosses in the north crosswalk, you'll mark that with an O. So males are X's, females are O's. If you don't know if the person is male or female, like today, there may be people with jackets on and it's really hard to tell, or they may have babies with them and you don't know if the baby is male or female. So you mark a plus in that case. So a plus means can't tell. There is a chance that you may be at an intersection where there's all sorts of people crossing in a large group at once. And, you know, if there's 20 people crossing, it may be really hard to tell how many males and how many females there are. So instead of recording X's and O's for the males and females in that case, you might just write down the number 20 and circle it. And that way we're just going to count it as 20 pluses, essentially. So there is shorthand that can be done in these relatively rare cases, but sometimes that happens.
Like water in Wisconsin.
Water in Wisconsin, it may happen. So that's something to be aware of. The most important thing is that we get the count of pedestrians crossing and bicyclists approaching right. That's always the most important thing. If we can get male and female split accurately, that's great, but that's number 2 after getting the count right. The other thing, another thing about when you count the pedestrians at the crosswalk, sometimes pedestrians don't stay within the crosswalk lines where they're painted. So a question may come into your mind, well, if somebody crossed a few feet away from the crosswalk lines but aren't in the crosswalk, should they be counted? The answer is yes, as long as they're within 50 feet of the intersection. Now, based on our observations and research over time, most pedestrians who are crossing at an intersection or close to it are within 50 feet of it. There are mid-block crossings too, but those don't get counted as intersection crossings. We do it when they're within 50 feet. How far is 50 feet? Roughly, if you think of about 3 or 4 car lengths, that's about 50 feet. So if you look at the parked cars, if somebody jumps out between the parked cars that are the first and second ones that are close to the intersection, they are going to be counted as being within that 50 feet. You do not want to count pedestrians who may come to the intersection but not cross the street. If they are coming up to the intersection and they take a right turn without crossing, they don't get counted. This is different than what you would do in the case of a bicyclist. So if you remember, I defined the bicyclist count as when the bicyclist essentially approaches and arrives at the intersection. The bicyclist may turn left, the bicyclist may go straight, or the bicyclist may turn right. If the bicyclist is on the sidewalk turns right on the sidewalk and doesn't even cross through the intersection, they still get counted. So you may ask, what is the difference between a pedestrian and a bicyclist? A bicyclist is somebody who's actually actively riding on their bicycle. If somebody is walking with their bicycle, they are counted as a pedestrian. People on skateboards, people on rollerblades, people who are in wheelchairs or using other assistive devices, they are all counted as pedestrians. The only people who we really count as bicyclists are people who are on bicycles or tricycles. They can be electric bikes or completely human-powered bikes, but they do not include motorcycles or combustion engine sort of scooters.
No segways, no
Segways.
mopeds.
Segways is a great question. That would count as a pedestrian.
Oh.
I didn't put that on the list, but
Very
segways
rare.
count as pedestrian.
Electric moped.
Electric moped. That is a tough one. If it looks like a moped, we count it as a motorcycle, not as a bicycle. But it's a fine line, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what else do I need on this? Let's see. I'm going to look at the instructions here again to make sure I didn't miss anything on that. Oh yes, there's one other thing that's a little bit different than the Bike Feds version. I have asked people to document helmet use, if possible, if they're able to catch and view the bicyclists as they go along. This doesn't have to do with saying that helmet use should be a required policy or not. That's a whole other thing for research and debate. But just getting data on that is something that's useful for the future. If the bicyclist is wearing a helmet, you underline the X or the O. So you put an underscore under it, and that indicates that they're wearing a helmet. If they're not wearing a helmet, you just leave the X or O plain. That's how I've designated that in the past. It seems to work okay.
Are we still doing traffic violations? Because that was part of the bike.
So, this is another slight difference. Thank you for asking.
I just did this with other groups.
Yeah.
So I'm like, what is
So,
the difference?
there's one other thing that's different than the Bike Fed's typical way of doing this. And there's a space down here below the bicycle side of the diagram that has additional bike rider data, people of color, traffic violations, and women. So we're already getting male and female differences by recording that in each box. We aren't going to be looking at traffic violations or trying to designate people of color. I think it's a pretty hard thing to tell whether somebody is officially a person of color or not. You can definitely estimate that, and if you feel like doing that, you're definitely welcome to do that, and you can mark tallies down in here. You can also mark tallies for traffic violations. That includes bicyclists disobeying a red signal or running through a stop sign.
Sidewalk riding?
Sidewalk riding, could be noted if you wanted to. I don't want to require anybody to do that, but that's something that you could note down here in the box. Those sorts of things, especially if you're at a not very busy intersection, they can help you pass the time, for one thing. But if you're at a very busy intersection, trying to note these other things may distract you from the main purpose, which is to get the total count right. So that is the most important thing to remember.
Sidewalk is if you're 12 and under, you can ride on the sidewalk. But if you're over 12,
What was it, 10?
Yeah, I don't want to be quoted on the actual number of the age, but there is an age for the city of Milwaukee that they have set for sidewalk riding, whether it's legal or not. Any other questions about that general procedure? Thank you for asking about that. I almost forgot to do that.
Just the difference.
Yes, one other thing for the knowledge of the people who weren't able to make it. Down at the bottom, there are pedestrian crossing totals and bicycle trip totals for each leg and turning movement. Once you're all done with the 2 hours, you can record those numbers, total everything up that you've tallied in the boxes of the diagrams, put them down below. Once you've got that tallied, that's what goes into the spreadsheet to summarize and just send back to me so I can put it all in the main database so we keep the count data all in one place and can share it easily.
And the spreadsheet is in the email, right?
Spreadsheet is in the email. Yep. And so that spreadsheet essentially has each of these boxes here for each 15 minutes. So for a 2-hour count, you're going to fill in 8 rows of the spreadsheet. There's one tab for the afternoon count on a weekday, which is 4 to 6 p.m. on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. And then one tab for the Saturday count, which is 12 to 2 on the Saturday.
Did we also talk about tandem bikes and Burleys? Or
oh yeah, that's a great question too. So if you are recording bicyclists, you're counting not just the total bicycles, you're counting the total number of bicyclists. So if there are 2 people on a tandem bike, they get counted as 2. And if you have, somebody's riding with their kids in the back trailer, the kids are going to be counted as bicyclists as well. Even though they are in a trailer, they're part of that bicycle that is moving down the street. That's how we'll define it for what we're doing.
Just like you count a stroller as.
Right. Just like a baby in a stroller is counted as a pedestrian. Now, can you tell if there's 1 or 2 kids in the trailer? Sometimes it's easier to tell than not, but do your best. Yeah. So I think that's everything for questions here, and then we're going to go out and do a little practice. After practice, we can come back and take some more questions because things will come up. So thank you. All right, I had 2 excellent questions already. Again, first, before I get to yours, we had a question about the overall time frame. When do we have to get these done by? So what we're wanting to do is 1 weekday count, a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday from 4 to 6 in the window between now and the July 4th weekend. Same with the Saturday count, 12 to 2 p.m. on a Saturday, anytime before the July 4th weekend. July 4th weekend has a Saturday on it. We're going to avoid that because that's a very special, activity. So we want to get all these counts done by July 4th. Secondly, we had a really good question about bicyclists. Well, actually 2 good questions about bicyclists. One, what if somebody arrives at the intersection on their bicycle, but then gets off their bike to cross the street? So they don't actually make a left turn, make a right turn, or go straight on their bike. They're actually counted as a pedestrian when they cross the street because they got off their bike. That's how they participated in the intersection, to use Ramsey's term. So you want to record it how they're participating in the intersection, which is either as a bicyclist or as a pedestrian. If somebody gets off their bike when arriving at the intersection, they'll be counted as a pedestrian. We had a question about what about bicyclists who make a left turn by acting as a pedestrian? That is, they cross one direction first, wait at the corner, and then cross the other way, both on their bike, let's say in this case first. So they're on their bike when they're doing this movement. They just had to wait for the light to change to the opposite direction before making the left. In that case, they're counted 1 time for making a left turn as a bicyclist. But that is a very hard thing to do because you're watching a bicyclist through 2 phases of the traffic signal. You need to make sure you don't lose track of all the pedestrians who are crossing at the same time when the bicyclist is doing that. So if you need to forget about the bicyclists and just write them in as a bicyclist in general, you should write it in above here or over there or down here or over there. So you just make sure that you counted that bicyclist. Eventually you can figure out and add, this was somebody who turned left or turned right or turned left. Really, those left turns are the hardest. Great question. Anything tricky about what you guys saw there? What are the hardest parts about this?
One of the things the gentleman engaged us in conversation.
Yeah.
That can really throw us off.
Absolutely. If I were doing this on my own and not with the group here right now, I would say I'm sorry, I'm doing some official counts and I need to focus on the intersection.
I wear my headset so people don't think
That's a good option too. Because yeah, if you get distracted by somebody, you end up missing a number of counts. You
The
don't want
challenge
to do
is distractions for me.
that. Yeah.
When we're ADD.
Well, and then just seeing one particular person who may have kids along with them, and it's so exciting to look at that person, but then there's other people crossing another crosswalk. You got to keep your mind on everything else. So that's tricky. The hardest thing for me, I think, is to keep track of the bicyclists. And what I would say, you got to do it the way that fits best for you, but always take note when the bicyclist is arriving at the intersection, even if you don't know if they're going right, straight, or left yet. You eventually need to put them into one of those boxes, but the most important thing is to note that they're there, at least in your brain. And then, as you're counting the pedestrians and everybody else, or you're waiting for them to make their movement, make sure they're still up there and get them on the feet.
It's better to count them to get the wrong direction than to not count them at all.
Right, absolutely. It's better to count them and get the wrong direction than not count them at all.
What about like semi-trucks and buses causing visual impairments?
Yeah, great question. Did you guys hear that? And what happens when there's semi-trucks or big vehicles that block the way? So you may not actually see where that bicyclist goes, or you may suddenly realize that there's a bicyclist riding away from the intersection that way. They must have gone through here somehow, but I missed them completely. So you want to mark their tally somewhere to make sure that the count is right. Even if you don't get the right leg or the right turn, you made sure you got that count correct. Good? Good? Oh yeah. Crystal clear.